In 1848, the Smithsonian Institution published its very first scientific document. Not a paper on astronomy, not a study of the natural world. The first thing the newly founded institution chose to put its name on was a survey of American earthworks, the massive geometric mounds, burial platforms, and ceremonial enclosures built across the eastern half of the continent by people whose identity, in 1848, the Smithsonian itself admitted it could not determine. That document was called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. It was written by Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis, and it ran to nearly 300 pages of careful measurements, detailed illustrations, and site maps covering hundreds of locations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. It was meticulous work. And embedded in its careful prose was a question the authors could not answer, a question that would define the Smithsonian's institutional agenda for the next half-century. Who built these things? The mounds were everywhere, tens of thousands of them. Conical burial mounds, flat-topped platform mounds the size of city blocks, geometric enclosures covering hundreds of acres with mathematical precision, animal effigy earthworks stretching across entire hillsides. They predated European contact by centuries in many cases. Some predated it by more than 1,000 years. And by the mid-19th century, the dominant popular theory of their origin, the theory that most educated Americans held and that political leaders quietly found useful, was that they had been built by a vanished race, a superior civilization, gone now, replaced by the people Europeans actually found living here. That theory had a name, the lost race theory, and it was not a fringe idea. It appeared in best-selling books. It was discussed in Congress. It provided a particular kind of comfort to a nation engaged in the systematic removal of native peoples from their land, because if the people being removed were not the original builders, if they themselves had displaced a more advanced civilization, then the violence of expansion could be reframed as something other than it was. In 1882, 34 years after publishing that first survey, the Smithsonian Institution formally created its Division of Mound Exploration under the Bureau of American Ethnology, funded by the United States Congress, and assigned it a mission: to settle the question once and for all, to determine who built the mounds, to find, as the institutional language of the era phrased it, America's true origin. What happened over the next 12 years, what was excavated, what was collected, what was published, and what the official record does and does not fully account for, is a story that has never been told completely. And the place to start is not with what the Smithsonian found, it is with who the Smithsonian chose to lead the search, and what that man believed when he began. The version of this story that appears in standard American archaeology textbooks is straightforward and, on its face, a story of science working as it should. By the early 19th century, the lost race theory had taken hold in popular American imagination. Writers like Josiah Priest, whose American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West sold tens of thousands of copies after its 1833 publication, argued passionately that the mound builders were a separate, vanished people, possibly descendants of ancient Israelites, possibly a pre-Columbian Norse civilization, possibly a lost branch of humanity with no connection to the native peoples still living across the continent. The theory was embraced beyond fringe circles. It found its way into early Mormon theology. It was discussed approvingly in newspapers across the country. When the Smithsonian created its mound exploration program in 1882, the Standard account says it was responding to this popular mythology with rigorous science. Cyrus Thomas, the man appointed to lead the program, spent 12 years directing field surveys of approximately 2,000 mound sites. He and his teams collected thousands of artifacts, and in 1894 he published a 730-page report concluding, based on the physical evidence, that the mounds had been built by ancestors of Native American peoples, not a separate race. The lost race theory was wrong. Science had corrected a myth with evidence. End of story.
That account is not false. Thomas's scientific conclusions have held up. Modern archaeology, radiocarbon dating, genetic analysis, improved stratigraphic methods has consistently confirmed that the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian mound-building cultures were built by populations ancestral to historical Native Americans. On the central scientific question, Cyrus Thomas got it right. But I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming here. The scientific conclusion being correct does not mean the institutional process that produced it was without problem. And the problem is not with what the 1894 report concluded. The problem is with what a single federal institution holding a monopoly on federally funded American archaeology, controlling the physical custody of thousands of recovered artifacts, publishing the only official account of what those artifacts meant, what such an institution chose not to pursue after the verdict was rendered. I came to this story through a question that seemed minor at first. If the 1894 report settled the scientific question, why was the next major federal legislation touching these collections, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed nearly a century later in 1990 in response to the discovery that the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History was holding tens of thousands of Native American skeletal specimens whose provenance could not be fully documented? And why, decades after that law passed, does the repatriation process remain incomplete? The answer to those questions runs directly back to 1882. The Bureau of American Ethnology was created by Congress in 1879, 3 years before the Mound program launched. Its first director was John Wesley Powell, Civil War veteran, the first man to lead a documented expedition through the Grand Canyon, and by 1879, the dominant figure in American federal science. Powell was a brilliant man and a powerful institutional operator. He was also the architect of a specific theoretical framework drawn heavily from the cultural evolutionism of Lewis Henry Morgan that divided human civilizations into fixed developmental stages: savagery, barbarism, civilization. This framework was not unusual for its time. It was, in fact, the mainstream scientific consensus of the late 19th century. But it shaped what the Bureau of American Ethnology was designed to find, and it shaped how evidence from mound sites would be interpreted when it came back from the field. Powell did not just want to answer the mound question. He wanted to answer it in a way that established federal science, his federal science, housed in his institution, funded by Congress, as the sole legitimate arbiter of American prehistory. When he appointed Cyrus Thomas to lead the Division of Mound Exploration in 1882, he was not simply assigning a researcher to a project. He was consolidating federal control over the physical evidence of American origins. This is documented history. It is not speculation. The first layer of evidence is institutional and financial. The Division of Mound Exploration operated on a congressional appropriation that began at $5,000 in 1882 and grew over the following decade. That funding came with something no independent researcher could match: federal authority. Thomas's teams could access sites, conduct excavations, and remove artifacts under the backing of the United States government. Everything they recovered, every artifact, every skeletal remain, every object taken from every one of the approximately 2,000 sites surveyed, entered federal custody under Smithsonian collection protocols. There was no competing federal program. There was no independent peer review of collections methodology. There was one institution, one director, and one emerging conclusion,
all funded by the same Congress that was simultaneously managing the final phases of Native American land dispossession. Roger Kennedy, in his 1994 book, Hidden Cities, Kennedy was a former director of the National Park Service, not a fringe writer, argued directly that the political economy of the mound question was inseparable from its scientific treatment. The lost race theory, whatever its scientific deficiencies, had been politically useful to the expansion project. Its replacement by a Native American origin narrative was scientifically correct, but did not eliminate the institutional incentives that had shaped the research agenda in the first place. The second layer of evidence involves the field record itself.
Thomas's 1894 report is 730 pages. It is a serious document. But the field notes from the Mound Survey program, the raw, on-site records kept by Thomas's field teams during actual excavations, are housed separately from the published report. They are held at the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian Support Facility in Suitland, Maryland. Researchers who have worked in those archives have noted something worth examining, that cross-referencing the field notes with the published conclusions sometimes surfaces discrepancies, instances where what was recorded at the site and what appeared in the official publication do not map onto each other with the precision you would expect from a program whose entire purpose was evidentiary rigor. I want to be precise about what this does and does not mean. I am not claiming the field notes prove deliberate falsification. The discrepancies that have been noted by researchers working in those archives are reported at the level of Category B evidence, credibly observed by people who access the material, not independently verified through primary source analysis for this investigation. What it means is that the published report, for all its length and apparent thoroughness, is not the same thing as the complete evidentiary record, and the complete evidentiary record has never been fully made public. The third layer of evidence is the newspaper archive. Between roughly 1850 and 1910, American newspapers ran hundreds of accounts of unusual skeletal finds from mound sites across the eastern United States. These are real documents. They exist in digitized form through the Library of Congress's Chronicling America archive. They describe repeatedly and across multiple states and multiple decades the discovery of skeletal remains from mound contexts that field workers and local observers described as unusually large. The New York Times ran a documented item in December of 1930 referencing earlier reports of such finds. Regional papers across Ohio, Illinois, and the upper Mississippi Valley published similar accounts throughout the 19th century. Here is where intellectual honesty requires a pause. 19th century American journalism was not governed by the evidentiary standards of modern science. Reporters exaggerated, editors ran sensational copy, measurements were eyeballed, not calibrated. The same cultural appetite that made the lost race theory popular made giant skeleton stories good newspaper copy. The existence of these reports in the historical record is documented fact. What the reports physically describe cannot be independently verified. They are historical documents, not physical evidence. Any serious treatment of this material has to hold both of those things simultaneously. The reports are real, the claims require scrutiny. What makes the newspaper record worth examining, despite that caveat, is not the size claims themselves. It is the pattern of what happened to the physical specimens those reports describe. Multiple accounts reference remains being collected by field teams, in some cases specifically by Bureau of American Ethnology representatives, and transferred to institutional custody. The subsequent public record of those specific specimens is, in most cases, incomplete, not because the Smithsonian necessarily destroyed them, but because the collection and documentation practices of the 1882 to 1900 period produced a provenance record that a federal law passed in 1990 found to be inadequate. That law was NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And what it revealed is the fourth and most concrete layer of evidence in this story.
When NAGPRA required federal institutions to inventory their holdings of Native American human remains, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History disclosed that it was holding tens of thousands of Native American skeletal specimens collected over more than a century of federally funded archaeology. Many of those specimens had incomplete or unverifiable provenance documentation. The institution could not, in all cases, say with certainty where specific remains came from, when they were collected, or under what conditions. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented finding of federal law compliance proceedings. It is in the public record. The repatriation process mandated by NAGPRA began in 1990. Decades later, it remains incomplete. The Smithsonian continues to work through its inventory. The collections accumulated under programs like Thomas's Mounds Survey, collections assembled under a federal monopoly on archaeological authority, with documentation practices that were the standard of their era and inadequate by the standards of any subsequent era, remain only partially reconciled with the public record. The counter-argument at this point deserves direct acknowledgement because it is not a weak one. The mainstream position in American archaeology is that the Smithsonian's Mound program was legitimate science, that Thomas's conclusions were correct, and that the incomplete documentation of 19th century collections reflects the practices of the era, not deliberate suppression. NAGPRA's incomplete implementation, by this reading, is a bureaucratic and logistical problem, the sheer scale of decades of collections, not evidence of concealment. The newspaper reports of unusual skeletal finds are, by this reading, a product of 19th century journalistic sensationalism, not a suppressed physical record. That argument is partially persuasive. It has to be taken seriously. What it does not answer is why the institution that staked its founding scientific reputation on the mound question, that published its very first document on the subject in 1848, exercised sole federal control over all physical evidence from the definitive investigation into that same question, without independent peer review of its collections practices, and why the physical record of what was actually recovered remains, to this day, not fully accessible to independent researchers. In the published record of the Bureau of American Ethnology's Mound Survey, Cyrus Thomas is a methodical, careful scientist doing his job under institutional constraints he did not entirely design. But there is another figure in this story whose trajectory tells you something the official record quietly omits. His name was Warren King Moorhead. Moorhead was an archaeologist who began his career as an associate of the Bureau during the Mound Survey era and went on to become one of the most significant American field archaeologists of the early 20th century. He excavated Cahokia, the massive Mississippian mound complex in present-day Illinois that was, at its peak around 1100 CE, home to more people than contemporary London. He led excavations at Fort Ancient in Ohio. He served on the board of Indian commissioners. He was not a crank or a sensationalist. He was a serious researcher with a long institutional record. Moorhead spent decades advocating, through official channels, through published papers, through direct correspondence with Smithsonian administrators, for more rigorous public accounting of what the Mound Survey program had collected and what had happened to specific artifact categories that appeared in field records but not in published catalogs. His correspondence, held at the Peabody Museum at Harvard and partially documented in historical literature on American archaeology, shows a man who understood the institutional dynamics he was operating within and who kept pushing anyway, through the accepted channels, for a more complete record. He did not get it. Not through obstruction, necessarily, not through any single dramatic refusal, through the quieter, more durable mechanism that institutions use to manage inconvenient persistence, delay, redirection, the gradual accumulation of unanswered letters, the suggestion that the question had already been settled, the implicit message that continuing to press it placed a researcher outside the boundaries of respectable scientific conversation. Morehead died in 1939. The archives he sought fuller access to are still not fully cross-referenced with the field records from the surveys he spent his career trying to understand. His fate was not dramatic, it was administrative. The suppressor in this story does not have a single face or a single decision. It is more uncomfortable than that, because it is institutional in the specific way that American federal science is institutional, which is to say, it is not a conspiracy, it is a structure. The Bureau of American Ethnology under John Wesley Powell operated as the sole federally funded arbiter of American archaeological interpretation during the most active period of mound excavation in the nation's history. It controlled the funding, it controlled the field access, it controlled the collections, it controlled the publication. There was no independent peer review body with equivalent resources or authority. If you were an American archaeologist in the 1880s and 1890s who wanted to work on mound sites with federal support, you worked within Powell's framework or you did not work.
Morehead died in 1939. The archives he sought fuller access to are still not fully cross-referenced with the field records from the surveys he spent his career trying to understand. His fate was not dramatic, it was administrative. The suppressor in this story does not have a single face or a single decision. It is more uncomfortable than that, because it is institutional in the specific way that American federal science is institutional, which is to say it is not a conspiracy, it is a structure. The Bureau of American Ethnology under John Wesley Powell operated as the sole federally funded arbiter of American archaeological interpretation during the most active period of mound excavation in the nation's history. It controlled the funding, it controlled the field access, it controlled the collections, it controlled the publication. There was no independent peer review body with equivalent resources or authority. If you were an American archaeologist in the 1880s and 1890s who wanted to work on mound sites with federal support, you worked within Powell's framework or you did not work. Powell was not a villain in the melodramatic sense. He was a scientist with genuine convictions and genuine accomplishments, who also happened to be the dominant operator in a federal bureaucracy during a period when the conclusions of that bureaucracy had significant political utility. The framework he built, cultural evolutionism applied to American prehistory, was the mainstream scientific consensus of his era. That it also happened to produce conclusions that serve the interests of federal Indian policy is not a coincidence that demands conspiracy as an explanation. Structural alignment between institutional science and state power does not require conspiracy, it requires incentive. What the structure produced was this: one institution, operating without external accountability, accumulated the physical evidence of American origins, published the official interpretation of that evidence, and retained the custody of the physical record against which the official interpretation could theoretically be checked. That custody was maintained for over a century. The law that required partial accounting of that custody was passed in 1990 and remains incompletely implemented. Roger Kennedy, a former director of the National Park Service, a man who understood federal institutions from the inside, wrote in Hidden Cities that the political economy of the mound question was inseparable from the funding structures that shaped its investigation. The nation that needed the lost race theory to be wrong for one set of political reasons in 1894 was the same nation that needed the physical record of ancient American origins to remain under federal institutional control for the century that followed.
That is not a conspiracy, it is a system. And systems are harder to argue with than conspiracies because they do not require anyone to have done anything wrong. The Smithsonian's Mound program was not an isolated event. It was one iteration of a recurring structure in American institutional history. In 1849, 1 year after Squire and Davis published their foundational mound survey, the United States government created the Department of the Interior, the federal body that would ultimately oversee Indian affairs, land management, and the disposition of territories whose original inhabitants built many of the mounds the Smithsonian was about to spend 30 years investigating. The institutional machinery of territorial consolidation and the institutional machinery of archaeological interpretation were built in the same decade by the same federal government for overlapping purposes. In 1902, John D. Rockefeller funded the creation of the General Education Board, which, over the following decades, provided tens of millions of dollars to reshape American educational curricula. The documented history of the GEB, available in institutional records and studied by historians of American education, shows an explicit focus on what students would be taught about American history, American economics, and American civilization. The content of those curricula, including what was emphasized and what was omitted about pre-colonial American civilizations, was shaped by private philanthropic money flowing through the same era that produced Powell's archaeological consensus. In 1996, a construction crew working near Kennewick, Washington, found a nearly complete human skeleton in the bank of the Columbia River. The remains were approximately 9,000 years old. Before scientists could complete their analysis, the United States Army Corps of Engineers moved to rebury them under a NAGPRA interpretation. 8 scientists sued the federal government in federal court.
The case took 9 years to resolve. The court found in favor of the scientists. The full record of that legal proceeding, a documented case of federal institutional authority being used to restrict scientific access to ancient American skeletal remains, is in the public record. Every one of these cases follows the same structure: federal institutional authority, control over physical evidence, a scientific or interpretive conclusion that serves the interests of the controlling institution, and a subsequent record that is incomplete in ways that cannot be explained entirely by accident. All of them in the same institutional lineage, all of them touching the same question, all of them producing the same result: the physical record of ancient American origins remaining under the custody of the institution with the greatest interest in controlling how that record is interpreted. This is not a story that ends in 1894, or in 1939, or even in 1990. The Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History is currently the home of one of the largest collections of Native American human remains in the world. The NAGPRA repatriation process, the federally mandated accounting of what was taken from whom and when, has been underway for more than 3 decades. It is not complete. The collections that trace their provenance to programs like the 1882 Division of Mound Exploration are among those whose documentation remains only partially reconciled with the public record. The National Anthropological Archives, where Thomas's field notes from the Mound Survey are held, is accessible to researchers by appointment at the Smithsonian's support facility in Suitland, Maryland. It is not freely digitized. It is not fully indexed in cross-reference with the published 1894 report. The raw evidentiary record of the most consequential federally funded archaeological program in American history, the program that settled the official question of American origins, is physically present. It is held by the same institution that conducted the program. It is accessible in the way that inconvenient things in federal archives are often technically accessible.
you can apply to look at it. Most people do not. The electricity you pay for, the land your neighborhood sits on, the history you were taught in school about who lived here before Europeans arrived and what those people built, all of it was shaped in ways both large and invisible by institutional decisions made in Washington in 1882 by men who were not accountable to you, whose field notes you have not read, and whose collections you cannot inspect without an appointment. That is not metaphor. That is the documented structure of how federal science and federal land policy were built in the same decade by the same government in the same city. Cyrus Thomas got the central scientific question right. The mounds were built by the ancestors of Native Americans. The lost race theory was wrong, and the evidence showed it. But a correct conclusion reached through a closed process by a monopoly institution with a physical record that remains incompletely public more than 130 years later, that is not the same thing as a settled question. It is a conclusion that has never been fully testable because the evidence it rests on has never been fully accessible. The Smithsonian published its first document in 1848 asking who built the mounds. It published its definitive answer in 1894. The physical material from which that answer was derived has been in federal custody ever since. What would be in those field notes, cross-referenced completely against everything that was recovered, indexed against every site, every date, every artifact category, and made fully available to independent researchers, not by appointment, not through the institution that collected it, but as the public record it was funded with public money to produce? That question has never been answered, and the institution that could answer it is the same institution that has held the evidence for 143 years.